LiSTNR production.
Ted Kaczynski terrorised the United States for almost 20 years. But what was it like forensically analysing the letters of a twisted genius known as the Unabomber? In this Rewind episode, we speak with Max Houck, one of the world's most respected and recognised forensic scientists. During his time at the FBI, he worked on some of the world's most infamous forensic investigations, including 9/11, D.B Cooper, and the Unabomber. Crime Insider's forensics host Kathryn Fox takes a deep dive into Max's career to hear the incredible stories of his forensic investigations.
I was getting ready to go out to dinner and got a phone call from my boss who said, you have to go in the lab. There's going to be evidence walked through. And he said, you just need to collect, package. It's pull whatever you can off of it, label it, package it like you would normally would. And then when you're done, you're done. I don't know how long you're going to be there. That was part of the job, which for me was interesting. For my wife at the time, not so much, because like I got home and she said, where have you been? I was, gone for hours. And she said, what happened? And I said, I can't tell you.
But did you actually know when you got the call what it was about?
No.
Because you didn't need to know.
I didn't need, exactly. And that's the thing about having a top secret clearance. At the Bureau, everything is need to know. So yeah, you and I might have the same clearance, but if you have no reason to know what I'm doing, I'm not telling you. So even between scientists, right, I would work on cases and there's stuff I didn't have to tell my coworkers if it didn't relate to them, because it may have been something within the case. So I don't even know if my boss knew. I don't remember now. So I go in and I set up a little station, not really knowing what's going to come through, right? So I'm prepared for a kind of variety of tools and things laid out. And walking evidence through the lab means, instead of having an extensive chain of custody, right? I sign everything over to you, you look at it, you sign it back to me, and then I sign it over to somebody else, and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. The evidence is in the possession of that special agent. It never leaves their sight. So they have possession of it the entire time. So the chain of custody is whoever signed it to them, they have it, and then wherever they sign it out at the end.
So they're watching you the whole time as well?
They're right there the whole time, yeah. So that's what walking through means. So it would go to me, and then it might go to documents, it might go to DNA, it might go to whatever, right? So they bring the stuff in as a bunch of envelopes. And I start looking at the edges and the corners, because envelopes are sticky and they've got little edges and the stamps are sticky. And when people fold things up, depending on their environment, things get folded in. So I'm going through these documents and I realize they're letters, they're typed up letters. And I start looking at some of the words and it clicked what I was looking at. Because previously, the Washington Post and the New York Times had published the manifesto of the Unabomber. And the Unabomber was somebody that had been literally making bombs from scratch, like making nails that fitted into the boxes. I mean, everything was made. So it was almost impossible to trace.
Very meticulous too.
And very meticulous. And he'd heard a number of people. He'd killed, I forget how many people at the time. And he had approached the New York Times and the Washington Post about publishing his manifesto, which is basically an anti-technology screed. And I read it because my boss had been working on that case as well. And so reading the words, I went, well, that's a pretty specific phrase. I think I know who this is. And what had happened was the Unabomber's brother had read the manifesto, realized the same thing, that the wording in there was what was like the wording in the letters that Ted had been sending to his brother, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. And he was almost positive that his brother was involved somehow. And so he'd gone through a private investigator and an attorney and submitted the letters to the FBI. And that was the urgency of it before he could act again and send out another bomb.
I always thought the Unabomber was named that because he was acting on his own. He wasn't an organisation, a terrorist organisation or an extreme group. But it's not. Why was he called the Unabomber?
For special cases, for major cases, the FBI will give it a name. It's either a random term or typically it's a grouping of letters to make kind of an acronym. So Unabomber got the name, the case got the name Unabomb because his first two targets were a university professor and an airline. And he'd used a bomb, so it was Unabomb, right?
In Australia, it probably would have been Unibomber.
True.
So when you arrive, what are you laying out? What sort of special tools of your trade are you preparing to use, and what is each tool used for?
This is probably going to be the ultimate letdown of an answer. It's pretty ordinary stuff other than the microscope, right? So I've got a stereo microscope so that I can magnify things, not like a transmission microscope. I don't have to put stuff on a slide, but it's a microscope that I can move objects underneath and look in the corners and...
Like a giant magnifier.
Bingo. But other than that, I'd cleaned the table beforehand and put on a fresh lab coat. I had gloves on. And then I'd laid out brown craft paper to cover the table and then set the microscope down. And then I laid out a couple sets of tweezers, forceps, technically, very fine pointed metal and some plastic forceps, a couple scalpels, a pad of Post-it notes, and then evidence tape and evidence packaging that we would use at the FBI, which for most of trace evidence is typewriter paper or photocopy paper. I just dated myself by saying typewriter.
Photocopy paper.
But paper, just regular writing paper.
Does most of it have to be sterile and have been cleaned? No.
No. It doesn't have to be sterile. So I would look under the microscope and use the forceps, the tweezers to move things around or remove evidence, or probably also had a bottle of ethanol, because if a fiber, for example, is stuck against something that's adhesive, like a postage stamp or the envelope seal, a couple drops will release the adhesive and I can pull the fiber out with the tweezers. But the evidence would either go into, as I was looking, I would take a piece of, it sounds so silly, it's so boring, but it works so well. I would take a Post-it note, peel it off, turn it upside down so that the adhesive was up. And as I found things, I'd put it on the adhesive. So I could label the item number on the paper part, and then just stick the fibers or whatever it was I was finding on the adhesive so that it wouldn't blow away.
And it's not a permanent adhesive.
And it's not a permanent adhesive. And so, yeah, it's little things like that you learn over.
They're tricks of the trade that actually people are fascinated by.
I don't know why, but okay.
Well, we are.
And then when I was done, I would take one of the pieces of writing paper and I would make what's called a pharmacist's fold, or a bindle sometimes it's called. So imagine a piece of paper, you fold it in thirds and then rotate it 90 degrees, fold it in thirds again. And then you take one of those ends and fold the corners in so you've got a point, right? Like you're making a paper airplane. So now what you can do is open that end up. If you look inside, you have a contained package that you can put evidence in, stick the pointed end into the open flap, and then seal it with evidence tape, and nothing's going to leak out. You might ask, why don't you just use an envelope dummy, because it's already all folded? If you look at normal envelopes, in the corners, the paper isn't always closed. There might be little holes. Little gaps. And you don't want the evidence just leaking out the end. So you go to the trouble of making the fold. Plus you can write on it, and it can lay flat, it's lightweight, it's the perfect evidence collection method.
In terms of what you found that day, did you later learn whether that actually helped contribute to the case?
I think it gave them better indications of where he was located, because he was in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. I mean, no running water, no electricity, it was middle of nowhere, and he was constructing these bombs out there.
An absolute neo-Luddite.
Right, yes, yep. Because I remember finding fibers, some hairs, think it was a feather. So it probably gave them a slightly better indication of, they had some idea, obviously, through other investigative means, but I think that may have helped.
How soon after that was he arrested?
I don't remember, but it wasn't very long because it became quite clear.
So they were closing in on him, obviously, once his brother identified.
Before that, he was almost a ghost.
It must be odd working in that bubble, that you know this is really critical time-wise. There's so much pressure on you to get it right. You've got a special agent, not just any agent, a special agent. I have to ask you this before too. Why are FBIs always called special agents?
Because that's what Hoover wanted them to be called. And so when the FBI was created, if I remember right, it was originally under Treasury, and it wasn't much of an agency. There was a lot of corruption, and they didn't get much done. And Hoover was very aggressive, probably the original Law and Order guy. And he took it and put it under Justice and renamed it and started specific training programs and educational requirements and a lot more rigor into what it took to become an agent. And he had a vision for the agency, and he wanted to make sure that everybody else knew about that vision. And so they weren't just agents, they were special agents.
And they weren't secret like the Secret Service.
Right. Yeah, no. They were, yeah. He wanted the public to know. He was also very good at what we would call marketing now. And he wanted people to know about, the special agents were at the door, right? They were going to come and get you.
So if anyone in a television show introduces them as a special agent, they're automatically FBI.
If the writers get it right, yeah.
I mean, it just feels to me like you're in a pressure cooker. It's almost like one of those movies where, you're being made to develop the bomb or to do this science experiment for
the blue wire,
baddie.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, it seems like that's the sort of pressure, or you have to diffuse, and you're under a ticking clock. What's the pressure of that sort of a job like?
Once you realize, and you should very early on in any forensic science career, once you realize what you're doing, every case is like that. Because there are people involved at the other end, right? Either it's the correct person and it's the suspect and they're under investigation, or they were wrongly arrested or convicted. And either way, their life and liberty are on line. There may have been a victim or victims, and their families and friends are also involved. So every case is that important. And so once you get into that mindset, there's a little extra, pressure with something like, Unabomber or 9/11. But once you understand that's the job, then the pressure kind of lets off because you treat every case as that important.
Coming up, what Max learned in the wake of 9/11.
So you were working in DC. Were you still there on 9/11?
Yeah, I was.
Do you remember getting the call, or did you find out publicly first about the 9/11 attacks?
I was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, preparing to testify in a case that a local agency had submitted to the FBI, and I'd worked the evidence, and I was down there to testify. And I was sitting in my hotel room waiting for the officer to come pick me up and take me to the courthouse. And I was watching TV, and I saw the first plane hit. And I immediately called in to my boss, and he said, that's all we know too. Just check back when you can. And while I was waiting for the car, I was out front. They had obviously all the TVs on in the hotel lobby, and the second plane hit. And I thought, well, there it is. That's it.
What was your first thought when you saw the first plane hit?
You think it's an accident, and then you think about it a bit more, and you realize how improbable that would be. I mean, planes crash. They don't crash into things that often, especially big planes. Our air safety system is unparalleled. And that's it's a big building, but flying with the Manhattan landscape, you could miss it. You could miss it easily. So my first, initially you think, well, it's an accident. So I got to the courthouse. Obviously, they'd shut down the courthouse and sent everybody home because it was what happened in the country at the time, right? It did never happen like that. There was a bombing in the World Trade Center, but it was in a basement, and it was nowhere near this extensive. So then I call in the office, and initially they said hold tight, because I think one of the terrorists had taken flight lessons near where I was, and they thought they may have me go and monitor the crime scene. And they said, no, get back. So
they knew that quickly.
Yeah. And then they said, no, get back here as fast as you can. And I couldn't fly because nobody was flying. So I went to a rental car place, got a car, and drove back. So I got back, and then I got assigned to Dover Air Force Base in Delaware. And that's where the military has their mortuary facility. So it's a massive, as you can imagine, it's a massive morgue setup, massive laboratory setup to handle all of the people who get killed in war. So I was assigned there. They had all of the military anthropologists. There were two of the anthropologists from the Smithsonian that I knew. And they had a few of the anthropologists from New York. They came down, but then just to let us know what was going on up in New York, but they were massively involved up in New York City. And of course, it's the military, and they have a process. And so twice a day, a C-130, which is one of the massive cargo planes, would fly in, land, and then all of the evidence that had been collected at the site, at the Pentagon, would go through a metal detector. And then it was like a conveyor belt. We refer to it as a disassembly line, because they would come through in order of being taken off, but there were designations of where it was found at the scene. So the crime scene was handled like a crime scene, just on a massive scale. Mm. And so we had to put things back together in terms of where they were found and what was close and all of that, and then sort of make sure things went together. And everything went through a process of photography, collection of personal effects, fingerprints if they were possible, dental, x-rays if they were possible, the whole business. And then they went to the morgue. And so I spent my time either on the line assisting with arranging and organizing and parsing out the evidence, or in the morgue working on the remains. And what was interesting was one of the things that has stuck with me professionally was the range of the condition of the remains. So it was everything from something that might fit in like a small teacup to, and I distinctly remember this, one person came through, not a mark on him, fully clothed, still holding his coffee cup. He'd had a heart attack at his desk. So it was the full range of what you would expect to see as an anthropologist. It was, it was small pieces. Some of it was burned. Some of it was crushed. Some of it was the gamut.
It was a significant part of the Pentagon building that was also involved. It wasn't just the plane. It was all those workers who were in there. Right.
Exactly. So it was everybody on the plane. Everybody was in that section of the Pentagon. And luckily, they'd been working on the Pentagon, and the goal was to reinforce the building against just such an event, and the plane happened to hit the one section that had been reinforced.
So the damage could have been far more extensive and far more fatal.
Plane probably would have gone straight through.
How long did you work on that case for?
I was there, I think, about 5 weeks.
How do you think it changed forensic science and forensic medicine and all of the sciences like anthropology and investigative science?
I think the main areas that it affected were anthropology and forensic DNA analysis, partly because of the scope of all of the sites, Pennsylvania, the Pentagon, New York. And that meant you had to ramp up the capabilities of laboratories very quickly, which is not easy to do. And they had to be validated. They had to operate under accreditation. There's all these restrictions that the laboratories work under. And so to scale up quickly is really difficult. It was at that time, really difficult. So there was a lot that changed in terms of how we learn to handle biological samples for DNA analysis. So things like robotics and sample handling and things like that. For anthropology, just because of the sheer number of samples and the small fragmented size of those samples, particularly in New York, at one time I think they had, because of 9/11, I'll put it that way, I think they had, I don't know, a dozen, 15 forensic anthropologists that worked for the city. Because when the towers fell and the debris went everywhere, people were finding pieces of bone on rooftops for years after that. And you need to do something with that. And so the need for having a lot of forensic anthropologists and the specificity of being able to work with very fragmented pieces became very important. Additionally, our ability to extract DNA from smaller and smaller samples, both nuclear, the type that comes from the cell, and mitochondrial, the type of DNA that's present in bone, hairs, teeth, things like that. It's in all other cells, but by the time you get to hair, bones, and teeth, the nuclear DNA largely is gone. Not always, but almost always. And you have to resort to mitochondrial DNA, which is it's a tougher molecule. So our ability to get more information out of smaller and worse, more abused samples has increased significantly. We're now at the point where we can detect more than we can interpret reliably. You can swab a fingerprint and get a DNA result in 90 minutes.
There was another case that I've actually been fascinated for years, and I've seen documentaries and all this conflicting and read stories and about alleged sightings of the person who supposedly did it. And that was the D.B Cooper case.
Right.
From the 1970s.
Yeah.
So can you just fill us in on the basic? It's something that you could not get away with as a writer, writing this story, because nobody would believe you.
It has a lot of strange quirks to it. So at the time, getting on an airplane was completely different than it is today. You could walk up to the gate, buy a ticket with cash. You walked out onto the tarmac, no security, and you walked into the plane.
And you could smoke in the plane, too.
You could smoke in a plane. It was like getting on a bus, right, or a train. You just walked in and sat down, and the plane took off, and there you go. There had been a spate of political hijackings, mostly to areas like Cuba. So Cooper is notable because it was the first hijacking of an airplane that was not political, because he asked for money.
It was a ransom demand.
It was a ransom demand, exactly. And that really is what makes it, at least initially, notable. It got a life of its own later on.
That's why the story has lingered too, because there was this large amount of money involved.
Well, and the fact that his remains were never found. But we're getting ahead of our skis on this. So the basic story, and it's been a while since I've gone over this, so I may not get all of it exactly right, but one of the passengers on this plane gets into Seattle, and the plane takes off, and he sits next to a flight attendant and passes her a piece of paper, and she thinks, and he's giving me his phone number and, hitting on me. And so she doesn't look at it, and he says, "You really need to read that note." And on the note it said, "I have a bomb," and I think it mentioned the amount of money that he wanted, and he had a briefcase. He was dressed as a businessman, right? A dark suit, white shirt, black tie, sunglasses. And he opens up the briefcase, and in it is what to her looks like an explosive device. So she tells the captain, they land the plane, they get everybody off except him and minimal crew. And then they take off again. He's given them coordinates and also altitude, how to fly. And it was very low. And he had specific instructions. And so they got all the passengers off, and he wanted 4 parachutes. So they brought on 4 parachutes. And by the time they got it, prepped for his demands, the FBI had gotten money together from a bank. They had recorded all the serial numbers, so they knew if any of the money showed up anywhere, they would be able to trace it. So he gets the money, and he gets the 4 parachutes, and the plane takes off.
Back then, it was a lot of money too.
It was I forget,
200,000.
Yeah. It was significant. Right.
Which should be over $1 million today, I imagine.
It'd be a lot of money. So they're flying at the coordinates, and the pilot feels a bump in the plane and sees a light pop on the dashboard that the rear hatch was open. So again, remember at this time, you could just walk to the back of the plane and there were controls back there and you could pop open the door and drop a stairwell or whatever, right? Or stairway. It wasn't like today where it's all enclosed and all controlled. So what he had done was he'd put on one of the parachutes, went back, pulled a lever, the rear gate opened up and he jumped out.
And is it day or night by now?
It is nighttime. It's, if I remember right, it was either fall or winter over the Columbia River, Washington and Oregon. So it's cold. He was only wearing a business suit. They were flying very low over heavily forested areas. That's not a jump that even military professionals would make. The chances of being that low, that fast, even the plane had dropped its speed, but it was still going very fast. The chances of surviving that are slim. And that's all anybody heard about D.B. Cooper. And D.B. Cooper, by the way, was a misnomer from a journalist. He had given one name to the flight attendant, and the journalist misheard it and wrote in the paper D.B. Cooper, and that's where the name comes from. So it's not even the correct alias that he gave the flight attendant. So it was sort of a mystery because here's this guy who gets on a plane and does all this stuff and then gets away with the money.
So he's kind of a folk hero, like a bushranger would be. He's a folk hero, like the guys who allegedly escaped Alcatraz and got away.
Right. And the story grows, and conspiracy theories. There's an annual D.B. Cooper event. There's some bar called DB's, I think. I forget where it is.
And alleged sightings.
Seriously, they closed the case in 2017, but from the 70s until 2017, they would get 1,000 tips a month.
Wow.
Right? I mean, that's kind of how it gained its own life.
It's in the consciousness of everybody.
Yeah. So remember, he jumped out of the plane along the Columbia River. Okay. When I was working at the FBI, we got an anthropology case in, and it was a box, and in the box there was a human skull. Some guy in Nebraska, stay with me, which is pretty far away from the Columbia River. He had been cleaning out his grandmother's attic and found a box that had the skull in it and a journal of all of the trips that she had been on. And one of them was hiking along the Columbia River, where she found this human skull and thought it would be neat to take it home. I don't understand people sometimes, but there we are.
Who feels entitled to just souvenir a skull?
You'd be surprised. So obviously it's a human skull, and he says, I need to, not that grandma's a serial killer, but I need to do something with this. So he calls local law enforcement, and they look at it and go, all right, we're going to send this to the FBI. So they send it. Now, for me, one of the humorous things about this case is the law. I can't even remember what jurisdiction it was, but the law enforcement agency, the head, was positive they had D.B. Cooper. He was going to be famous. And so he goes to the press and starts talking about this and starts saying how we're going to determine the age and sex of this individual using carbon-14 testing, which is not how it works. That's not how any of that works. Just saying all these ludicrous things. And so we're seeing the newspaper and we're like, all right. So I get the skull. And I go to the Smithsonian and I work with one of the anthropologists over there. And we took all the measurements on the skull. There's about 25 or 30 measurements that you take with special calipers and almost slide rule looking things to do all the measurements. And then they had a software program that was written by anthropologists to then do metric analysis, comparative metric analysis of that skull. And it fit firmly within the range of characteristics for an indigenous American, so a Native American. So it was not D.B. Cooper. It wasn't even male, and it wasn't even Caucasian.
Was any of the money ever found?
So in, I think it was 84 or 86, there was a family vacationing along the Columbia River, and one of their kids found part of a rotting satchel that had money in it. And I think it was like $6,800. And the serial numbers matched some of the money had been given to Cooper. So that was the only other, I think that and his necktie, which he took off. It was a clip-on that he pulled off. I think those were the only two pieces of physical evidence that anybody's ever seen since.
But it's fairly suggestive that he in fact did die in that fall, because he would have taken the money with him after going to all that effort, one would assume.
That's how I would bet, yeah.
You've also worked with the Innocence Project, which most Australians are aware of, in terms of people who take up the cause of what they believe are miscarriages of justice. What's your involvement been?
So I've worked with the Innocence Project, which is specifically the office out of the Cardozo Law School in New York City. I've also worked with the Innocence Network, which are other innocence projects, plural, at other institutions throughout the United States. So there's an Innocence Project and there's the Innocence Network, and I've worked with both of them. I've been contacted by them typically on older hair cases, because hairs are a problematic type of evidence, but also fiber cases and just some other general science questions about, is this legitimate? Is this okay? Is this person overstepping their bounds in terms of what they're saying? And to me, I think it's something every forensic scientist should do, is work from the other side, work from the defense side, because then you'll start seeing this not really another side. It's the same thing, right? It's you get out of the mindset of the state, the prosecution.
And what were the problems with it, or what possible problems were there with it?
Exactly. Because the questions are a little different. Is this adequate note-taking? Are the results supported by whatever happens to be in the bench notes or the printouts? It's kind of like doing an audit, but it has been very educational for me and made me think back on what I've done in terms of my cases and how things would be done differently, which I think is good for everybody. A little humility never hurts.
So it's almost like peer review.
Right.
You're reviewing your peers' work, and how would you then, if you approach the work, do you then think, if someone else were to review this work in the future,
right,
what would they be saying?
Exactly. And that's the whole point of case documentation, is somebody should be able to come back years later and look at what you've done, and if not, come to the same conclusion, at least understand how you got to your conclusion.
Does it matter that you're looking through a more modern lens, with more modern techniques, more advanced technology? Because it's easy to criticize people who didn't know about DNA.
Yeah.
Whereas now a sample could be analyzed. Absolutely.
I think that's a problem that the majority of people who get into doing innocence cases or review any kind of cases is that historicity. They don't take that into account. So, for example, let's say pre-DNA, there's a blood stain at a scene and you have a suspect and you do the blood typing. The blood is type A, the suspect is type A. Could that person have left that blood stain? Yes, they're both type A. So could a significant proportion of the population. Now you run the clock forward, you do DNA analysis, and the DNA in the bloodstain does not match the DNA from the individual that you have. So that person is excluded. Was the blood typing wrong? No. He's still type A. It's a matter of resolution, right? How specific can you be with your answers? It's not right or wrong. Was the conclusion justified?
Is it likely that was that person's blood?
Well, you'd have to say the stain is type A, the individual is type A. It should be noted that X percentage of the population is type A, right? You have a jump between the science and then the law. Those are two very different professions that got shoved together some time ago. And so when a scientist says, oh, they're both type A and it's X percentage of the population, say the prosecutor will then say, well, the accused's blood was found at the scene. This matches his, right? You circumscribe a whole lot of science by saying match, right?
What
How the
does it mean?
layperson
Yes.
hears that, and then, instead of thinking, oh no, wait, there's a percentage of people that could have left this. No, they're like, oh, it's his. And so that disconnect between what a scientist says and what an attorney interprets
And what a jury hears.
and what a jury hears. Exactly. So to me, it's really important to go back and look not only at the bench notes, not only the reports, but also testimony, because scientists get blamed for stuff that attorneys say. Because like closing remarks, the attorney's summing up their side, prosecution or defense. I'm not in the room. I never hear it. So if that's the takeaway, I might get painted with that same broad brush.
One of the things that I was reading with the Innocence Project, I remember a case I was reading about where somebody was on death row and it was a sexual assault murder, and DNA years later was used and it was found not to be consistent with that
Individual.
convicted individual. But in terms of overturning that verdict, it was refused to be overturned because at the trial of that gentleman, the jury did not have DNA evidence on which to convict. So therefore, it had nothing to do with the conviction. So this gentleman was not exonerated. He was put to death because the judicial system seemed to look at it back then and say, well, it was of no relevance to the trial at the time because they convicted him without DNA.
One of my graduate professors always said that law is to justice as medicine is to health. Justice and health are relative terms, but law and medicine operate under their own sets of rules, shall we say. So don't necessarily expect health from medicine or justice from law.
And so you're not surprised by that?
Grossly disappointed, but not at all surprised, sadly.
So despite all the best efforts of science and scientists to actually work towards justice, you're still hamstrung by the legal system?
Exactly. I would tell my employees, remember, the science is between the doors of the lab. So the evidence comes in, we do the science, the report goes out, but once it's out the door, it's out of our hands. There's only so much we can do. We can only communicate so much, and you have to do the best possible way, but it's still, you're taking your output and throwing it into a different machine that's going to process it a very different way.
So how do you cope if you are working on cases with the Innocent Project? Do you detach yourself or compartmentalise your work? Or do you follow through on what actually happens with the cases?
I do the same thing that I would do when I was doing active casework for a governmental agency. The wording doesn't sound great, but I don't care. I guess the better way to put it is I detach myself.
Well, you can't afford to care.
I can't. Well, and also it's not my job for the very reason I have no control over that outcome. All I can do is produce the best information that I can, communicate it in as clear and accurate a way as I possibly can. And then after that, I kind of have to let go because it's out of my hands. Somebody might make what I think is a stupid decision, but there might be perfectly reasonable legal precedent for it. Whatever happens, there's nothing I can do about it.
You truly are a scientist.
I work at it. It's not easy because, again, like your example, I think that's horrendous. Completely out of the realm of science, though. You've shifted over to a completely different profession, domain, way of thinking, and
ethics is something very important to science as well.
Yes.
And that seems to violate everything that we imagine to involve ethics.
Pretty much everything, yeah. I used to teach ethics to criminal justice majors. I kept hammering them on Epictetus, the Stoic. I can't control what happens. I can only control how I respond to it.
You can whinge about the rain or you can learn to dance in it.
Right. Or carry an umbrella.
That's how we differ. This has been actually incredibly, special, and I don't mean about special agents, but special for me because having read so much crime and written and watched and observed and talked to so many real people who've worked in the fields, this has actually been a really, really special insight. So thank you so much, Max, for joining us today.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you.
That's all we have time for in this Rewind episode. If you know someone who loves true crime, recommend our series to them. And check out our videos by searching LiSTNR Crime on TikTok or Instagram. I'm Dan Mullins. Thanks for listening.